It was the summer of 1983 when a young couple, Mark and Lisa, decided to take a road trip across the rural countryside of Pennsylvania. They were recently engaged, full of life, and ready to make memories. After hours of driving through small towns and deserted stretches of road, they found themselves lost. Their map wasn't much help in the dense, eerie fog that had settled in, muffling sound and making everything feel unnaturally still. They passed by an old wooden sign with faded letters that read, Black Hollow Road. Thinking it might lead them somewhere, they took the turn. Little did they know that Black Hollow Road was whispered about in local legend, a place where travelers went in, but never came out. As they drove deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press closer. The thick trees on either side of the road grew twisted and sinister, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Mark glanced over at Lisa, who had grown silent, her face pale and tense. She said she felt like they were being watched. He laughed it off, chalking it up to nerves. But even he couldn't shake the unease that crept up his spine. Their car suddenly began to sputter and cough. Mark cursed under his breath as he pulled over, the engine giving out completely. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by silence and shadows. Mark tried his phone, but there was no signal. Lisa glanced around, her eyes wide with fear, noticing something he hadn't yet seen. A small cabin in the woods, barely visible through the trees. It looked abandoned, but they had little choice. Hand in hand, they ventured toward the cabin, each step heavier than the last. The ground felt damp and spongy beneath their feet, like the earth itself was sick. As they got closer, they saw that the cabin was in a state of decay. The wood was rotting, the windows dark and empty. Mark knocked on the door, but it swung open on its own, creaking slowly, revealing a dim interior. The smell hit them first, a nauseating stench of decay mixed with something metallic, like rust. Lisa covered her mouth, gagging, but Mark urged her in. "We need to stay warm while we wait for help," he said, trying to sound calm, but his voice wavered. They stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind them with a force that made them jump. The cabin was small, with only a few pieces of old furniture and walls covered in strange, hand-carved symbols. There were circles, crosses, and something that looked like an eye. In the far corner of the room, there was a rickety staircase leading to a cellar. Lisa grabbed Mark's arm, begging him not to go down there, but he felt drawn to it, like something was calling to him. He assured her he'd just take a quick look and be right back. Mark descended the stairs slowly, the creaking of the old wood filling the silence. He held his breath as he reached the bottom and peered into the pitch-black space. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he realized he wasn't alone. There were dozens of small figures on the floor, arranged in a circle. He moved closer, his heart pounding, and saw that they were dolls, crude, handmade, with eyes made of nails and mouths sewn shut with black thread. He turned to leave, but his foot hit something on the floor. He bent down, heart racing, and picked it up. It was a leather-bound notebook, worn and brittle. As he flipped through its pages, he saw drawings of the symbols that covered the walls upstairs, along with scribbled words that seemed to be prayers or chants in a language he didn't recognize. Then he reached the last page, and his blood ran cold. In large, jagged letters, it read, "They're watching. They always watch." Just then, he heard Lisa scream from upstairs. He ran up the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering. When he reached the main room, he found her backed against the wall, eyes wide, staring at the doorway. He followed her gaze and saw them, figures standing just beyond the threshold of the cabin, motionless and silent. There were at least a dozen of them, their faces obscured by shadow, but he could see their eyes. Dark, empty voids that seemed to suck the light out of the room. Mark felt rooted to the spot, his body frozen in terror as the figures slowly began to move, drifting toward the cabin like smoke. The door slammed shut again, though no one had touched it. Mark and Lisa backed away, retreating until they hit the wall. Nowhere left to run. They could hear whispering, a soft, rhythmic chant that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the chanting stopped. The room was silent again, and the door creaked open. But the figures were gone. Mark and Lisa bolted out of the cabin, racing back to their car. Miraculously, it started on the first try. They sped down Black Hollow Road, not looking back, the twisted trees and fog swallowing the cabin behind them. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, where they told their story to the local sheriff. He listened, his expression grim. "You're lucky you got out," he said. "People who go up Black Hollow Road don't usually make it back. That cabin, well, it used to belong to a man named Abel Kincaid, a recluse who practiced some dark stuff. People around here say he'd invite travelers into his home, only for them to disappear without a trace." Mark and Lisa exchanged a horrified glance. The sheriff sighed, looking out the window toward the road. "Some say he never really left, that he still waits for travelers to take that turn. I'd advise you two to stay clear of these parts from now on." They left town the next morning, but they could never shake the feeling that they'd been marked. Sometimes, late at night, they'd wake to a soft whispering, faint and distant, but growing louder, as though coming closer with each passing night. And sometimes, when they looked out their windows, they'd see shadows lurking just beyond the light, watching, waiting, their eyes dark and empty. A man named David, a recent widower, moved into an old house in a small town, hoping for a fresh start. It was the type of place that seemed peaceful during the day, with quiet rooms and high ceilings. But at night, things were different. Strange sounds echoed through the walls, floorboards creaked when he was the only one home, and whispers seemed to rise and fall like a distant, chilling wind. One night, as he was drifting off to sleep, he felt something icy brush against his face. Startled, he sat up, peering into the dark. Nothing was there. He shrugged it off, thinking he must have imagined it. But the next night, it happened again. This time, he felt fingers on his face, cold and firm, tracing the outline of his jaw. He shot up, scrambling to turn on the light, but there was no one in his room. David tried to ignore it, but every night the touch became more insistent, lingering longer, cold hands pressing against his face, his shoulders, his chest, like someone was there, someone unseen, growing bolder. One night he finally shouted, What do you want?" In the silence that followed, he heard a soft, barely perceptible whisper in his ear, "I'm here for you." There's a place off a rural road in Iowa known as the Witch's Window, an old abandoned house with a single broken window set crooked in the upstairs attic. For decades, locals have warned newcomers not to approach the house, especially not at night. Legend has it that a woman accused of witchcraft in the 1800s was killed there, and she still haunts the property. Anyone foolish enough to look into the attic window at night will see her staring back at them, her face twisted in rage. A group of teenagers, eager to prove they weren't afraid, dared each other to visit the witch's window on Halloween night. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they approached the house, making jokes and daring each other to go inside. When they reached the front, one of them, Sarah, looked up at the attic window, and there she was, a woman's face staring down, mouth open in a silent scream. Panicking, Sarah turned to run, but her friends laughed, saying she must have imagined it. To prove she was wrong, one of the boys, Kyle, went to look for himself. When he saw the face, he screamed, stumbling back, and the group fled to the safety of their cars. But the story didn't end there. That night, each one of them dreamed of the woman from the witch's window, her face looming close to theirs, whispering words they couldn't understand. When they awoke, they each had the same marks on their skin, 3 long, thin scratches down their arms. No one could explain how it had happened, but the marks wouldn't fade. They were reminders that they'd trespassed into something they shouldn't have, and each night after, they heard faint whispers, like someone scratching against glass outside their windows. A young woman named Alice had been hearing about the legend of the Midnight Caller for years. According to local lore, the Midnight Caller would ring your phone exactly at midnight. If you answered, you'd hear silence, then breathing, and finally a single word, come. One night, alone in her apartment, Alice's phone rang. She glanced at the clock, 11:59 p.m. She froze, her heart pounding. Surely it couldn't be real, just an urban legend. But curiosity got the better of her. She answered, and as she pressed the phone to her ear, she heard it. Silence. Then the unmistakable sound of someone breathing, deep and slow. She waited, heart racing, until finally a low, chilling voice spoke one word, come. Panicking, she hung up and turned off her phone. But seconds later, it rang again. She didn't dare pick it up, but the ringing continued, growing louder and louder. Desperate, she smashed her phone against the wall, shattering it. The ringing stopped. She let out a shaky breath, trying to calm herself. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard a knocking on her door. First, just one soft knock, then another, louder, and finally a heavy, relentless banging that echoed through her apartment. Terrified, she hid under her blankets, clutching a kitchen knife until dawn. When she finally mustered the courage to check, she found something scratched into her door. "I told you to come." In a small, forgotten village in Japan, there is a tale of a spirit known as the Smiling Woman. She appears only at night, on empty roads or in dark alleys, and those who encounter her are never the same. She wears a long, pale dress and a serene, unsettling smile, with dark eyes that seem to pierce right through you. She never says a word. She only smiles and watches. One night, a man named Hiroshi was walking home from work down an isolated road when he saw a woman standing in the middle of the path, looking right at him. Her face was pale, her smile unnaturally wide, and her eyes followed his every move. Feeling a chill, he quickened his pace, trying not to look at her. But the moment he passed her, she turned to follow, her footsteps silent. He broke into a run, heart pounding, but the faster he went, the closer she seemed, her smile never fading. When he finally reached his home, he slammed the door shut, breathing heavily, feeling safe. But when he turned around, she was there, standing in his living room, smiling, her face inches from his. The next day, Hiroshi's neighbors found him in his home, mumbling incoherently, his hair turned completely white. He couldn't remember what had happened or how she had gotten in. All he knew was her face, that chilling smile that haunted him every time he closed his eyes. From then on, he would catch glimpses of her in mirrors and windows, her eyes following him, her smile growing wider. These are stories that people don't forget, stories that pass from friend to friend, growing darker with each retelling. Maybe they're just stories, or maybe they're warnings. But next time you're alone, and the room seems a bit too quiet, or the shadows stretch just a little too far, remember these tales. And be grateful they're only whispers in the dark. A woman named Rachel moved into a house on the outskirts of town, trying to find some peace and solitude. The house was perfect, isolated, surrounded by tall trees, and well kept by its previous owner. But every morning, Rachel noticed something strange. She'd wake up to find muddy footprints on the floor, trailing from the door to her bedroom. Thinking she was being pranked, she called the police, who checked the property but found nothing unusual and no signs of forced entry. Determined to catch whoever was doing this, she set up a camera in her living room. That night, she lay in bed, trying to stay awake, but sleep overtook her. In the morning, the footprints were there again, stopping just beside her bed. Heart pounding, she retrieved the camera, eager to see what it had captured. The footage was dark and grainy, but she could make out the time, 3:14 a.m. Just as she squinted at the screen, she saw something move. A figure slowly appeared, creeping through her door, covered in mud, barefoot. The figure moved silently, drifting through her living room and toward the hallway. But the most chilling part was the face. She couldn't make out the details, but she saw a hint of a smile, something sinister and all too real. When she rewound the footage to check the beginning again, she nearly dropped the camera. Standing in the doorway, looking directly at the lens, was the figure, grinning as if it knew it was being watched. Rachel didn't stay in the house another night. There's an old bridge in West Virginia, known as Lover's Bridge. Locals say it's cursed. Legend has it that a woman, heartbroken by her lover's betrayal, threw herself from the bridge into the icy river below and drowned. Now every year on the anniversary of her death, people claim to see her standing on the bridge, waiting. A man named Tom, skeptical of all ghost stories, decided to investigate the bridge one night. He brought a flashlight and his camera, hoping to capture proof that there was nothing there. As he stood on the bridge, he felt the air grow colder, and a thick fog started rolling in from the river below. Suddenly, he saw a woman standing at the far end of the bridge. She was dressed in a long, pale gown, her hair flowing in dark, wet strands. She looked directly at him, her eyes sad but intense. He tried to call out to her, but his voice wouldn't come. She raised one hand, pointing to the water below, and began to walk toward him. Panicking, Tom turned to run, but his foot slipped, and he tumbled to the ground. He felt icy fingers on his ankle, pulling him toward the edge. He struggled, finally freeing himself and scrambling to his feet. When he looked back, the bridge was empty. But later, when he checked his camera, he found something he hadn't noticed before. Every picture he'd taken that night showed her face, pale and ghostly, just behind him, as if she'd been watching the whole time. A young couple, Jenna and Mike, had just moved into a new apartment in the city. They were excited, unpacking and decorating, thrilled to start their life together. But within a few days, Jenna started noticing strange things. Small objects moved, lights flickering for no reason, a feeling that something was wrong. One night, as she was brushing her teeth, she caught a glimpse of something in the bathroom mirror. Just over her shoulder, barely visible in the dim light, was the reflection of a man, standing right behind her. She spun around, but the bathroom was empty. She laughed it off, thinking her mind was playing tricks on her. But the sightings grew worse. Mike started experiencing them too. Shadows moving in the corners of his eyes, footsteps echoing in their empty hallway at night. They decided to do some research on the building and found that decades ago, a tenant had died under mysterious circumstances in their apartment. He was last seen entering the bathroom, but he never came out. No one knew what had happened to him. The apartment had been found empty, with no signs of a body. One night, Jenna woke up to a soft whisper in her ear. The voice was deep, distorted, repeating a single word over and over, "Leave." Her eyes snapped open, and she saw him standing at the foot of the bed, his face pale, eyes wide, mouth twisted in a grimace. She screamed, and he vanished. That night, they packed up and left, breaking the lease without a second thought. The landlord never questioned them. They weren't the first to leave suddenly, and they wouldn't be the last. There's an urban legend about the mirror game, a ritual meant to summon the spirit of someone who died in vain. According to the legend, if you stand in front of a mirror at midnight, light a single candle, and call the person's name 3 times, they'll appear in the reflection, ready to answer a single question. But the story warns not to ask about death, or the consequences will be severe. A girl named Laura, curious and skeptical, decided to try it with her friends one night. They gathered in her bathroom, lit the candle, and chose a name, Mary Ellen, a woman from their town who had died tragically in a house fire. Laura, holding the candle, spoke her name 3 times. They waited, staring at the reflection, but nothing happened. They were about to give up when one of the girls gasped. Laura looked back at the mirror and saw a shadowy figure standing just behind them, barely visible, with long, dark hair and hollow eyes. "Heart racing," she whispered. "What happened to you?" The figure's mouth twisted into a sad smile, and she opened her mouth to speak. But one of Laura's friends, panicking, asked, "Did it hurt when you died?" There was a silence, and then the figure's face changed, her expression twisted with rage. The candle flickered violently, casting strange, contorted shadows on the walls. The mirror cracked, and a chilling, guttural voice echoed in the small room, "You'll know soon enough." The friends fled, terrified, but each of them had strange experiences in the days that followed. One of them saw Mary Ellen's face in her bedroom mirror, grinning. Another heard whispers late at night, her name being called. Laura herself began having dreams of fire, flames creeping closer, until she'd wake up gasping for air. No one could shake the feeling that Mary Ellen hadn't left, and that she was waiting. Finally, there's the story of the vanishing hitchhiker. Drivers in rural parts of America have reported seeing a woman dressed in white standing on the side of the road, thumbing for a ride. Those who stop say she climbs in silently, giving them a cold smile, and she asks to be dropped in an old cemetery a few miles down the road. One night, a man named Carl was driving home late and saw her standing by the road. He pulled over, feeling sorry for her. She climbed in without a word, her face pale, eyes sad, and pointed down the road. They drove in silence, the air in the car growing colder as they went. When they reached the cemetery, Carl turned to ask if she was okay, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, though the car doors had never opened. Shaken, he drove home. The next day, curious, he returned to the cemetery, asking the groundskeeper if he knew anything about a woman matching her description. The groundskeeper only nodded sadly and said, "That sounds like Annabelle. She died on this road years ago, waiting for a ride that never came." These stories are reminders that there are things out there that can't be explained, shadows and spirits that linger, waiting, watching. And sometimes when you least expect it, they might just find you. So next time you're alone and hear a faint whisper or see a shadow flicker in the corner of your eye, think of these stories and pray they're just tales after all. A man named Ben was driving home late one night on an old mountain road known for its winding turns and sharp drop-offs. It was a foggy night and visibility was low. As he carefully navigated the road, he noticed a dim, flickering light up ahead. Thinking it was a broken-down car or someone in need of help, he slowed down. When he got closer, He realized it was an old lantern hanging from a tree branch by the side of the road. A man stood under it, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, his clothes muddy and torn. Ben pulled over and rolled down his window, asking if the man needed help. The man looked up, his face pale and his eyes hollow and dark. He didn't answer, but slowly raised a finger, pointing to something just beyond the tree line. Ben's heart pounded as he looked into the darkness, but he saw nothing. When he turned back to speak to the man, he was gone. The lantern was still there, swinging gently in the breeze, but the road was empty. Shaken, Ben drove off, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. A week later, he read in the local paper about a car crash on that very stretch of road. The driver had gone missing, but his car was found abandoned near an old lantern hanging from a tree. In a quiet neighborhood in upstate New York, there was an old, abandoned house that children dared each other to visit. It was the house of Mrs. Hargrove, a widow who had lived alone for years and was known to wander the neighborhood at night, whispering to herself. When she passed away, her house was left untouched, a crumbling shell filled with dust and shadows. One night, two teenagers, Jake and Leo, decided to break in and see what was inside. Armed with flashlights and daring each other on, they pried open a window and climbed in. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot, and as they made their way through the living room, they saw family photos hanging on the wall, old black and white images of Mrs. Hargrove and her family. But as they moved their flashlights over the photos, they noticed something strange. In each picture, Mrs. Hargrove's face was turned away from the camera, her back facing the lens, as if she'd refused to look at whoever had taken the photos. Jake shivered, suggesting they leave, but Leo urged him to go further. They made their way to the bedroom, where they found an old, dusty mirror leaning against the wall. Leo dared Jake to look into it, saying he'd heard that if you looked into Mrs. Hargrove's mirror, you'd see her reflection standing behind you. Jake laughed it off, calling it just another story. But as he glanced into the mirror, his blood ran cold. Standing just behind him, her face pale and eyes wide, was Mrs. Hargrove, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. Jake stumbled back, but the reflection didn't move. He scrambled out of the room, Leo closed behind, and they fled the house. When they reached the street, they looked back, and through the bedroom window, they saw her, Mrs. Hargrove, watching them, her face pressed against the glass. There's a story that people tell around a particular college campus, an eerie tale about the Watcher. The story goes that in one of the oldest dormitories, students would wake up in the middle of the night feeling a heavy presence in their room, a cold sensation that seemed to seep from the walls. Those who dared to open their eyes claimed to see a shadow standing in the corner, watching them silently. One night, a student named Emily woke to the feeling of icy fingers brushing against her forehead. Terrified, she lay perfectly still, her heart racing as she heard a faint whisper just above her ear. She couldn't make out the words, but the voice was soft, low, and relentless. Gathering the courage to look, she opened her eyes and saw him. A man in a dark coat, his face partially hidden in the shadows, leaning over her, his hand reaching toward her face. Emily screamed, but in an instant, the figure was gone. Her roommate ran to her side, asking what had happened, and Emily described the man. Her roommate paled, admitting that she had seen him too, standing at the foot of her bed the night before. Rumor has it that the Watcher was a former professor who lived on campus and met a tragic end. He continues to haunt the students, his silent presence reminding them that he's still watching, still waiting. A father and daughter were on a camping trip in a dense forest known for its strange occurrences. Local legend warned visitors to leave the forest before sunset, but they decided to stay late, building a fire as the sky grew dark. They laughed, told stories, and roasted marshmallows, enjoying the quiet sounds of the woods. But as night settled in, they began to feel uneasy. The firelight didn't seem to reach as far as it should, and the trees around them seemed to press closer. The father dismissed it as paranoia, but his daughter insisted she felt something watching them. Reluctantly, they decided to head back to their car. As they packed up, they heard soft, shuffling footsteps just beyond the tree line. The father called out, thinking it was another camper, but there was no response. Then they saw a figure standing between the trees. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its eyes glowed in the dark. It stared at them, unmoving, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Frozen in fear, they could only watch as the figure slowly lifted a long, skeletal hand and pointed at them. The father grabbed his daughter, and they sprinted toward their car. When they glanced back, the figure was gone. They got in and sped off, but for weeks afterward, the daughter had nightmares of that figure, its hollow eyes staring at her, its hand still pointing. She couldn't shake the feeling that it knew where she lived, and she swore she would sometimes see it in the distance, watching her from the shadows. In an old, rural town, there was a story about the Laughing Woman. The story went that if you were driving alone at night on a specific back road, you might hear the faint sound of laughter coming from the trees. If you stopped to listen, the laughter would get louder, closer, until you could feel the presence of someone standing just outside your car. A man named Carl had heard the story but dismissed it as nonsense. One night, on his way home from work, he decided to take the infamous back road as a shortcut. As he drove, he thought he heard something faint, like a distant giggle. He turned down his radio, listening. The laughter grew louder, as if someone were running alongside his car, laughing just behind him. He glanced in his rearview mirror and saw a woman's face, twisted in an unnatural grin, staring at him from the back seat. Her skin was pale, her eyes wide, and her mouth stretched far too wide, as if the skin had been torn to create that terrible smile. Carl screamed, swerving off the road. When he looked back, she was gone. The next morning, the local mechanic found his car abandoned on the side of the road. When they opened it up to investigate, they found muddy footprints in the back seat, but only on the passenger side, as if someone had been sitting there, waiting for him. These stories are the kinds that linger long after the telling, settling like a chill in your bones. They're reminders of what might be out there, watching, waiting, hiding, just beyond the edge of light. So next time you find yourself alone and you feel something brush against you, or you hear a faint sound in the dark, remember these stories and hope that what's out there is just a tale and not something waiting for you in the shadows. In a small Midwest town, there's a story about an old playground that's fallen into disrepair, its swings rusted, its slides covered in moss. Local legend has it that the playground is haunted by a child who went missing decades ago. According to the story, if you go there late at night, you might see a small figure swinging back and forth on one of the swings, just visible in the moonlight. One evening, a group of teenagers decided to test the legend, daring each other to go to the playground at midnight. They arrived, laughing and joking, but as they approached the swings, a heavy silence settled over them. The night felt colder, and they could see their breath fogging in the air. The swing in the middle started moving, creaking softly, though there was no wind. One of the teenagers took out his phone to record, but as he raised it, he saw a small figure sitting on the swing, head down, feet barely touching the ground. The figure was wearing old-fashioned clothes, a white dress smudged with dirt. One of the friends whispered for them to leave, but the boy holding the phone stayed, staring in shock. Slowly, the figure lifted its head, and he saw empty, black eyes staring back at him. The teenagers ran, but the boy who had seen the face never spoke about it again. He moved away from town shortly after, and his friends said he was never the same, always looking over his shoulder as if he was waiting for something, or someone, to find him. A woman named Sandra was staying at a quaint, old-fashioned inn in the countryside, a place known for its charm and history. She'd booked a single room for a weekend getaway, eager for some peace and quiet. The innkeeper showed her to her room, an antique-filled space with a large, ornate mirror above the dresser. Sandra settled in, but as night fell, she started to feel uneasy. She chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place and tried to go to sleep. Around midnight, she woke up feeling as though someone was watching her. She glanced toward the mirror and saw in the dim light a shadow standing just behind her reflection. She held her breath, terrified, but convinced it was a trick of her mind. She forced herself to close her eyes and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, Sandra went downstairs to ask about the history of the inn. The innkeeper looked at her strangely and mentioned a guest who had once died in that very room, under mysterious circumstances. When she asked about the mirror, the innkeeper hesitated before finally saying, "That mirror used to belong to him. He never seemed to leave it." Sandra left the inn early, never looking back. But sometimes when she caught her own reflection, she thought she saw a shadow lingering just behind her, a faint outline of the figure she'd seen in the mirror. In an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, a family was experiencing strange occurrences. Lights flickering, cold spots, and the unsettling sound of footsteps echoing in the halls late at night. The father dismissed it as old house quirks, but the mother and children were convinced something wasn't right. One night, their youngest daughter, Anna, came running into their bedroom, saying she'd seen the lady in her room. Her parents tried to calm her down, but she was adamant. She described a woman in a long, dark dress with a sad face who would sit at the foot of her bed, humming softly. They assumed it was just a bad dream, but over the next few weeks, Anna became withdrawn, barely speaking, and constantly looking over her shoulder. Desperate, her parents brought in a paranormal investigator who found something chilling. The investigator discovered that years before, a woman had lived in the house who'd lost her child tragically and had spent years in grief, sitting in the room that was now Anna's. One night, the parents heard humming coming from Anna's room. They rushed in to find her sitting on the bed, eyes wide, staring at the foot of the bed as if someone were sitting there. They took her out of the house the next day, and the family never returned. But to this day, some say they can hear soft humming if they stand outside that old house late at night. A young woman named Claire was house-sitting for a friend in a rural area, a large, beautiful home nestled in the woods. It was peaceful during the day, but at night, Claire couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One night, she was reading in bed when she heard soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the window beside her. Nervously, she pulled the curtain aside, but there was nothing there, only the darkness of the trees. Trying to ignore it, she settled back into bed, but the tapping started again, this time louder and more insistent. She looked again, still nothing. Finally, she decided it was just an animal, maybe a branch brushing against the glass. The next morning, she mentioned the tapping to her friend, who went pale. Her friend explained that years ago, a man had broken into the house and had been tapping on the windows, watching her for nights before finally entering. He was arrested, but some people believed his spirit had never left, still trapped, still tapping, still watching through the window. That night, Claire heard the tapping again, louder and closer, as if someone or something was right outside, waiting for her to look. One late winter night, a man named Daniel was driving home along a deserted country road, blanketed by fog and darkness. His car began to sputter, and he had no choice but to pull over. As he stepped out to check the engine, he heard soft footsteps on the gravel behind him. He turned, but the road was empty. Dismissing it as his imagination, he went back to the car, but the footsteps started again, closer this time. Heart pounding, he got into the car and locked the doors, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. In the foggy back window, he saw the faint outline of a face, just barely visible, staring directly at him. Panicked, he turned on the car, desperate to leave, but when he looked back again, the face was gone. He drove away, trying to shake the fear, but he couldn't help looking in the rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see the face again, watching him from the shadows. Later, he learned that a woman had been hit by a car on that same stretch of road and had been left for dead by the driver. Some say her spirit still haunts that road, waiting for a driver to stop and give her a ride. In a quiet, snow-covered town, a retired school teacher named Margaret began noticing strange symbols drawn in the frost on her windows every morning. At first, she thought it was children playing a prank, but the symbols grew more intricate and unsettling, resembling symbols she'd never seen before. One night, unable to shake the eerie feeling, Margaret stayed up late, keeping watch over the window. Just past midnight, she saw a shadow approach the window, moving slowly and deliberately. She held her breath, heart pounding, as a skeletal hand pressed against the glass, its fingers leaving long, frost-bitten streaks as it traced the strange symbols. She ran to turn on the lights, but when she looked back, the figure was gone, leaving only the symbols scratched into the frost. The next morning, her neighbor stopped by, mentioning that similar symbols had been found around town years ago, just before a series of disappearances. Margaret never stayed up to watch again, but every morning the symbols were there, etched into the frost as if warning her that something was coming. These stories aren't just tales to scare you. They're reminders that there are things we can't understand, events that defy explanation. Sometimes a place or a moment leaves a scar, a haunting that echoes back into the world. reaching out to remind us that some spirits never truly leave. So the next time you hear an unexplained tap, feel a cold breath on your neck, or glimpse something out of the corner of your eye, remember these stories and wonder if it's just your imagination or if something far more sinister is reaching out to you. A young man named Tom had just moved into an old apartment in the city. The building was charming, but worn, with cracked walls and wooden floors that creaked with each step. The landlord told him not to worry about the strange sounds he might hear, saying the building had personality. Tom brushed it off as old house quirks until the first night. At around 2 a.m., he awoke to the sound of tapping. It was soft, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on the wall next to his bed. Sleepily, he assumed it was a neighbor, so he knocked back. To his surprise, the tapping responded, mimicking his rhythm perfectly. Curious but unnerved, Tom tapped 3 times quickly, and the same rhythm came back immediately. He laughed nervously, convinced someone was messing with him, and went back to sleep. Over the next few nights, the tapping continued, always at 2 a.m., and always mirroring his patterns. One night, he decided to ignore it, trying to sleep through the noise. That's when the tapping stopped, replaced by the slow, unmistakable sound of breathing, heavy, labored breaths coming from right next to his bed. Heart pounding, Tom turned on the light, but his room was empty. Terrified, he asked his landlord about it the next day. The landlord hesitated, then revealed that the previous tenant, a man who had been severely ill, had been found dead in that very room. He had died alone, unable to call for help. They found him in bed, tapping the wall in a desperate attempt to alert someone.
In a coastal town,
there was a stretch of beach known for its beauty during the day and its haunting atmosphere at night. Locals warned visitors not to go near the beach after sunset, saying it was haunted by the singing lady. People claimed that if you stood too close to the water at night, you would hear her singing, a soft, sweet lullaby that seemed to drift over the waves. A couple, Amy and Jake, visiting for a weekend getaway, heard the story but brushed it off as superstition. They decided to walk along the shore at dusk, eager to watch the stars over the water. As they walked, Amy thought she heard faint singing, and she joked that it must be the singing lady. Jake laughed, but as the sky grew darker, the singing grew louder. It was beautiful, eerie, and seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. When they stopped to listen, the singing grew clearer, and they could make out a voice whispering, "Come closer, come closer." Suddenly, Amy felt a cold hand grip her ankle. She looked down and saw a pale, waterlogged hand reaching out of the sand, pulling her toward the water. Screaming, she managed to kick free, and they both ran from the beach without looking back. When they told a local about the encounter, he nodded gravely and said that many years ago, a woman had drowned there after being swept out to sea. Every few years, another person would vanish from the beach at night, never to be seen again. In a suburban neighborhood, a single mother named Rachel moved into a new home with her young daughter, Emily. The house was perfect, except for one odd feature: a dusty antique dollhouse left in the attic by the previous owners. Emily was immediately drawn to it, marveling at its intricate rooms and tiny furniture. Rachel didn't think much of it, letting her daughter play with the dollhouse. But after a few weeks, Emily started waking up in the middle of the night, complaining about the little people in the dollhouse. She said they moved around at night, calling to her to come play. Rachel assumed it was an overactive imagination until one morning she went into Emily's room and found the dollhouse sitting in the center of the floor, a spot she knew she hadn't left it. Curious, she peered inside and noticed something chilling. A tiny figure, dressed exactly like her, sitting on a miniature bed in the dollhouse's master bedroom. When she moved the figure, Emily screamed, saying she'd made them mad. That night, Rachel heard faint footsteps in the attic, tiny but unmistakable. She went upstairs, heart pounding, and saw that the dollhouse's lights were on, a soft glow illuminating the miniature rooms. She never found out who or what was inside that dollhouse, but she moved out soon after, leaving it behind, never to return. A man named Leo was working the night shift at an old hospital, rumored to be haunted. One night, while making his rounds, he entered the basement to check on some storage. The basement was cold and dark, filled with the stale smell of disuse, but Leo had been there many times before and knew it well. As he walked through the narrow aisles of medical supplies, he heard faint whispers. Thinking it was just the pipes, he kept walking, but the whispers grew louder, shifting from incoherent murmurs to distinct phrases. "Help me. Please don't leave me." He tried to ignore it, but then he heard footsteps coming up behind him, slow and shuffling. He spun around, but no one was there. Shaken, he started back toward the stairs, but as he did, he heard a low, agonized moan coming from behind a closed door at the end of the hall. Against his better judgment, Leo opened the door, only to find an empty room with an old, dusty hospital bed in the corner. Suddenly, the door slammed shut and the lights flickered out. He felt a cold hand touch his shoulder, and a voice whispered, "Why did you leave me here?" The lights flickered back on, and he found himself alone in the room. When he asked a coworker about it, she told him that years ago, during a power outage, a patient had been accidentally left in the basement overnight. He'd been found dead the next morning, and his last words a plea to not be left alone. Leo never went back to the basement again. An old woman named Mrs. Harper lived alone in a small, isolated house at the edge of town. One day, she received a strange letter in the mail, written in shaky handwriting. The letter simply said, "I'm coming to see you. Be ready." Thinking it was a prank, Mrs. Harper ignored it, but over the next few days she received more letters, each one saying the same thing. "I'm getting closer. Be ready. I'm almost there." Disturbed, she showed the letters to a neighbor who brushed it off, saying it was probably just kids playing a trick. But that night, Mrs. Harper heard footsteps outside her window. She stayed up, terrified, but no one came to the door. The letters continued, and each one made her more anxious. The final letter simply read, "Tonight." She sat in her living room, clutching a flashlight, listening for any sounds. Around midnight, she heard a faint knocking on the door, but when she looked outside, no one was there. As she turned to go back inside, her flashlight flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, she saw a face in the window, pale, with hollow, empty eyes staring at her. The police found her the next day, unharmed but visibly shaken, insisting that someone had been watching her all night. Strangely, none of the letters could be traced, and no one ever figured out who or what had been sending them. These stories tap into the fears that linger deep inside us all, the fear of the unknown, the unexplained, and the things that go bump in the night. So next time you feel that prickling sensation, the feeling of being watched, or hear the faintest tap in an otherwise silent room, remember these stories. They may just be stories, or they may be warnings, reminding us that we're never truly alone, even when we wish we were. A man named Joel had recently taken up photography and was exploring abandoned places to capture eerie, atmospheric shots. One day, he found an old house on the outskirts of his town, almost swallowed up by the woods. It looked like it had been empty for decades. The paint was peeling, and the windows were coated in grime. He entered through the back door, carefully avoiding broken glass and rotting floorboards, his camera in hand. Inside, the house was dusty and damp, with old furniture scattered around. He made his way to the living room, where a large, ornate mirror was hanging crookedly on the wall. He couldn't resist snapping a picture of it. Just as he clicked, he saw movement in the mirror, a dark, shadowy figure standing directly behind him. Startled, he turned around, but no one was there. Heart racing, he checked the photo on his camera. The figure was still there in the image, standing close enough to reach out and touch him. The shadow had no face, only hollow, empty eyes. Joel ran out of the house, abandoning his project. Later, when he tried to delete the photo, it refused to disappear. To this day, the image remains on his camera, a haunting reminder of what he saw. A young mother, Nina, lived in a small town with her son, Liam. One night, while tucking him into bed, Liam whispered, "Mommy, the man in the closet says good night." Chilled, she looked over, but the closet door was closed and the room was empty. She brushed it off as a child's imagination. A few nights later, Liam mentioned the closet man again, describing him as tall with red eyes. This time, Nina felt her skin prickle. She checked the closet but found nothing unusual. She told Liam it was just a dream, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next night, she awoke to the sound of soft humming coming from Liam's room. As she crept down the hall, the humming grew louder and she noticed Liam's door was ajar. She peeked inside and saw him fast asleep. But her blood ran cold when she saw the closet door slowly swing open. revealing a tall, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes staring directly at her. She slammed the door shut and ran to get her son. They left the house that night and never went back. To this day, Liam occasionally whispers that he still dreams of the closet man who watches him from a dark corner, waiting. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a couple, Lily and Marcus, moved into a small 2-story house with a charming attic. The house had been on the market for a long time, and they'd gotten it for a good price. The first night there, as they were settling in, they heard soft footsteps above them in the attic. They assumed it was an animal, but the next morning they found nothing there. The footsteps continued every night, always at the same time, moving slowly across the attic floor. One evening, they decided to go up together, bringing flashlights. When they entered the attic, they found it dark and empty, save for a single chair in the center of the room. As they examined the chair, they noticed strange scratches all around it, as if someone had clawed at the floor in desperation. Lily noticed a faint smell of perfume, old and musty, hanging in the air. Just then, they heard footsteps, directly behind them, even though no one else was there. They fled the attic, and that night, as they lay in bed, they heard the chair scraping across the attic floor above them, moving closer to the attic door. Eventually, they left the house, never finding out who or what had made those sounds. But every new owner has reported hearing the same footsteps, pacing back and forth as if something is trapped up there, waiting. In a small mountain village, there was a story about a ghostly train that appeared on foggy nights. Locals called it the Midnight Spectre, and said that once every few years it would rumble through the valley with an eerie whistle. Those who saw it would hear the sounds of screams and cries as it passed, a reminder of a tragic accident that had happened long ago when a passenger train derailed, killing everyone on board. One evening, a group of teenagers decided to camp near the old tracks, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Midnight Spectre. They joked about it, daring each other to stay up all night. Around midnight, a thick fog rolled in, cloaking the valley in silence. Suddenly, they heard the sound of a train whistle, faint at first but growing louder. They peered through the fog and saw the outline of an old-fashioned train approaching, its headlights cutting through the mist. As it drew closer, they could see shadowy figures in the windows, their faces twisted in horror. One of the teenagers swore he saw a face staring directly at him, mouth open in a silent scream as the train passed by. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the train vanished into the fog, leaving only silence behind. They fled, vowing never to return. To this day, locals warn travelers to avoid the tracks on foggy nights, saying the Midnight Spectre carries the souls of those who can never rest. An elderly woman named Helen lived alone in a small house on the edge of town. She was used to the quiet, except for the gentle ticking of her grandfather clock, a gift from her late husband. But one night the clock stopped ticking and she felt an eerie stillness fill the house. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. She would find small objects, keys, spoons, even her glasses, move to strange places, always in pairs. Her lights would flicker at odd times, and once she heard faint laughter echoing through her empty halls. The worst was when she began to notice cold spots, chilling patches of air that seemed to move from room to room. Finally, she brought in a local psychic who claimed that the house was haunted by the spirit of her husband, but that he wasn't alone. The psychic said Helen's husband was caught in the house, trapped there by another, more malevolent spirit who was angry and vengeful. Helen refused to leave her home, saying she couldn't abandon her husband, but the disturbances only grew worse. One night, she awoke to find a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her with eyes that glowed like embers. She heard a voice, low and guttural, saying, "He's mine now." The next morning, the clock began ticking again, but Helen's husband's spirit was never seen or felt again. In a remote, wooded area, there's a popular hiking trail with a sinister reputation. Locals say that if you hike alone, you might hear footsteps behind you, even if no one is there. A hiker named Sam decided to explore the trail despite the warnings, curious about the tales. As he walked deeper into the woods, he heard footsteps behind him, heavy and deliberate. Each time he stopped, the footsteps stopped, and whenever he looked back, he saw nothing but trees. Nervous but determined, he continued. The footsteps returned, this time accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Growing terrified, Sam quickened his pace, but the footsteps followed, echoing louder with every step. Finally, he broke into a run, and the whispers turned to low, mocking laughter. Just as he reached the end of the trail, he felt something cold brush his shoulder, like a hand reaching out to grab him. When he looked back, he saw a figure standing in the shadows, barely visible, watching him. Locals say the trail is haunted by the spirit of a man who went missing there years ago. People claim he waits in the woods, angry at anyone who dares to cross into his territory, hoping to claim another lost soul. These stories are reminders that some mysteries are better left alone, and some places may hide secrets darker than we can imagine. So next time you hear a creak in the floor, feel a sudden chill, or see something just out of the corner of your eye, remember, sometimes the scariest things are the ones that seem to follow you long after you've left them behind.